Good evening. Welcome to the first installment of Cafe Culture Northeast's autumn season of digital events, which are in fact all digital dialogues, because I think that's a really good format for the Zoom platform. Just a quick introduction to Cafe Culture Northeast. It is a consortium, a collaboration between various bodies based in Newcastle upon Tyne in the northeast of England. I don't know where all of the participants are from. Some of you may be from England, others not, but it's a participation between the Institute of Public Policy Research North, the Philosopher Journal, the Newcastle Philosophy Society, Northumbria University, and the Policy, Ethics and Life Sciences Research Centre at Newcastle University. We run events on science, politics, philosophy, and arts and culture. So for the first installment of our season, it is one of the science events, and we're delighted to welcome Matthew Cobb and Stephen Casper, who are going to be talking about the idea of the brain. Just a quick introduction to both the speakers, who I will bring up on the screen shortly. Matthew is a zoologist by training, professor of zoology at Manchester University. He's unusual insofar as he's published a lot of works in science, but also works in history. For example, the resistance, the French fight against the Nazis. The book he'll be speaking about today is a book published earlier this year called The Idea of the Brain, A History, which is as it sounds, an epic exploration of the history of the brain, the ways we've thought about it over millennia. And he will be joined to discuss the book by Stephen Casper, who is a historian of neuroscience based at Clarkson University in the US. His research interests include the politics of neuroscience, and he's currently working on a book about the history of concussion. So just a brief overview of the format for the evening. Matthew and Stephen will talk for about half an hour, and then it will be opened up for questions. Please feel free throughout the event, if a question comes to mind, to post it to the Q&A bit at the bottom of your screens. If you want to dialogue or chat with each other using the chat function, you can do that, but we won't necessarily be checking that. I will also post relevant material that comes up to the chat function. So if, for example, Matthew's Twitter account is discussed or a link to his book, I will post that as we go along. So without further ado, I will bring up, hopefully, Matthew and Stephen, and we will get cracking. So thank you very much to both of you, and I will now mute myself and we will get on.
All right, good evening, and thank you, Anthony, for this delightful opportunity for me personally. And Matthew, it's very nice to meet you in person. Your book is just terrific, and you know, actually there aren't enough accolades that I could give it, so I'm just going to leave that hanging there. People are going to know that this isn't an altogether interview without prejudice, but let's just begin by saying that you're active on Twitter. I just pull that up for a second so people can see how they can follow you. And why don't you give us some tweet-sized takeaways that describe your book for us, so that people can find out what, if they read it, what they'll find there, or if they have read it, recall what it's about.
Okay, Stephen, before we go any further, some of the attendees are saying they can't hear.
Okay, well, so we will always have glitches. It's not a problem.
Can attendees, can you, a couple of you, Tonya and Richard, have said, okay, so other people are saying it's working fine. Okay, right. So if it's not working, you need to, I don't know, press something on your computer. It's your fault, not ours.
Yes, let me just give everybody a quick run through. So, sometimes you have multiple sound settings on your computer that could be blocking your ability to to hear. Matthew and I can hear each other, and we can also hear Anthony, which suggests, since I'm in the United States and Matthew is, I believe, somewhere in Manchester, that we probably are working, and we have lots of people also saying that it's working. If you're having trouble, hit the ask for some advice in the chat. Anyway, we'll come back to you now, Matthew. Tweet size takeaways about your book.
Okay, thank you very much. And yes, what's the book about? Well, the book is a history, as you said, and it's not simply one damn thing after another. When I was writing it, it started off that way, and it was getting a bit boring. So what I ended up doing, and here's the tweet size summary, I realized that there was a thread running through what I was writing. And that thread was how, through time, different metaphors have been used by scientists to understand how the brain works, what it is. And I realized that that was, in fact, very, very interesting, how ideas shape the brain. And that's where the title came from. The title came right at the very end of the writing process, from my US editor, in fact, TJ Kelleher. He came up with the idea for the title, and I realized that that was the best way to go. So it's a history of neuroscience, but seen through the optic of how people have been thinking about the brain. What it isn't is much about philosophy. So people who are really into metaphysics and arguments about ideas about consciousness. There is a chapter about consciousness, but it's not that.
Well, we're going to get into metaphors in a little while, but let me just pull up the title of the title page of your book so people can take a look at it and see it. There it is, The Idea of the Brain. I highly recommend it to all of you if you've not yet picked it up. But Matthew, what I'm interested in personally is the story of your book. So why don't you just give us a little bit of an exposition about how you decided to write it, where it came from, what the inspiration was. I think we can definitely see the centrality of metaphor, but as you said, it came at the end. So what was the beginning?
Well, the beginning was, commercial books rather than kind of academic books. Commercial books are rather odd things in that you have to sell them to a publisher before you've written them. And so basically you have to come up with an idea. And as it happens, this wasn't, I'm pretty certain it wasn't my idea. I finished, just published a book about the history of the genetic code called Life's Greatest Secret. And my editor, my UK publisher, was then thinking about, he had various ideas. He said, why don't you write a book about the brain? And so I thought, okay, well, that's challenging. And we discussed it. And then I wrote a kind of summary, a pitch, a 2 or 3 page summary of what I thought it would be like. And he said, okay. And they bought the book, and which means that therefore I get a small advance, and I've then got to write it for them. And during the writing, as I said earlier on, it kind of grew, and it wasn't so much that it was boring, but it was a bit just one damn thing after another. And I realized it needed a bit more meat to it. And once I'd realized that kind of conceptual framework for it, then that changed it quite substantially. Must be said that there's an awful lot of reading and writing involved in it. It took me about 4 years, and I was disrupted by lots of things, including Brexit, Trump, lots of things, personal life and work and all the rest of it. It was a lot of work, a lot of reading.
Yes, the ambition of it is staggering. I mean, when I sat down with it and began reading it, the feeling of the source material that you had gone through, it actually staggered me. I mean, when you think about it, basically that process, were you using libraries at Manchester, or what were the sources? How did you sort of get all of that together in one place for yourself?
There's this amazing thing called the internet. And so basically I just spent, I did go a little bit, I did get some books from the library here at Manchester, which is a marvelous library. And I also, I'm afraid, bought a lot of books secondhand. So abebooks.com was my friend, and that was extremely useful. But an awful lot of stuff, especially the old stuff, is actually available online. So it's been scanned, and it's either on Google Books or on archive.org, and you can actually read and search that material. So often, if I wanted to find, I knew there was something in a book, say from the 18th century, it was often, now it's actually pretty trivial to say, well, okay, do they write about the brain? And you can just type it in. So one of the things I noticed very early on is that I could go into both the online versions of the Bible and the Quran and see, well, what do they have to say about the brain? And the answer is, well, either not very much in the case of the Bible and nothing at all in the case of the Quran. So to be able to make that statement, there is nothing, the word brain is not mentioned in the Quran. I mean, if in the old days, I'd have had to go through every damn page and then worry that I'd missed it. So basically, it was an awful lot of electronic use of texts and searching in those texts for things that I thought were reliable. But above all, I rely on other scholars. So I know, so often when scientists write the history of science, they think that they can invent it all, and they, you know, all you've got to do is be clever and know about your science and it all comes clear. But of course, there are a lot of very hardworking, very intelligent historians who've actually already gone through some of this stuff. So I always made as my starting point, well, what have the historians been writing about? What are the articles? What are the books about this period, or whatever? And often they quite, perhaps unsurprisingly, they completely changed what I was going to write, because I realized they introduced me to people who I'd never heard of, or they gave me an angle that in a vague sense I knew about, but didn't really understand. And then this historical way of thinking, more analytical rather than just, you know, well, how did we get to here, which is kind of what scientists generally think about, that was really incredibly useful to me. So at every stage, I would be making sure that I'd read up on the history, and I was referencing and citing the historians, because you don't want to annoy people by pretending that you've invented it all when somebody else has done all the work.
Well, I think we can safely say that the historians are bowing towards your achievement here. But your mention of the Quran and the Bible actually interests me, and it's curious. One of the things that I've struggled with as a historian of neuroscience over the years is that you know, you face this problem where the neurosciences, as we conceptualize them, including clinical neurology, are comparatively new fields of inquiry in terms of what we might call the professional sociology of the fields. And yet, you rightly identify the brain and the heart as extant topics that have been part of the philosophical tradition of multiple peoples, multiple cultures. And you know, so your book begins actually about as far back as you can get, right? Ancient Assyria with the Epic of Gilgamesh. And you know, what I found myself wondering as I was reading this is that when you're thinking about the evolution of the idea of brain, how do you deal with something like, for example, the heart, which is where your book begins, as a forerunner of neuroscience? And let me just say this maybe a little bit more sharply, right? How does it make sense, or how does it make sense to think of those older ideas of brain as past expressions of neuroscience, do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a legitimate question, because they clearly aren't actually. So ideas that your emotions or your soul or your thought is based in your heart are clearly, they're very interesting. And what I discovered was that they were utterly widespread. So I knew clearly from the English language. So you can say, I wear my heart on your sleeve. I feel down at heart. All those heart phrases we have in English. In fact, we have in other languages as well. I gave a talk in Bulgarian a few months ago, and I said to them, I normally show a slide with all the various phrases. I said, can you please translate them into Bulgarian, which they did. I then back translated to check they hadn't written rude words in there. So every language has this what in fact is a palimpsest. It's a relic, a fossil, a linguistic conceptual fossil of the old way of thinking about things. And I think what's interesting is that it's true. So you don't, and it tells us something really quite interesting about psychology, because you don't actually feel that you're in your head. You might know it to be the case, that that's where thought is based, but it doesn't feel that way. If you're feeling excited or frightened or whatever, you feel it viscerally, it's in your body. And I thought that was particularly interesting, that these older ideas, as well as still floating about in our language, they're there for a reason. They're there because they make sense. And a number of studies have actually demonstrated this. If you ask people, where do you feel various emotions, and they then give you an answer, then most emotions are felt in the body, not at all in the head. You might say, well, my vision's in my head because your eyes are there. But anything more interesting than that, it's very, very difficult to localize where it is. The other reason why I wanted to start with that is that it also gave me a way of at least recognizing that there have been, for most of our history, other ways of thinking about it, about what thought is and how it works and where it is, than the current way, which is basically come about in the last 400 years. And so I wanted to explore different cultures. Now you're then limited by language and by written records. What do we know about what other people's thought about this? And whilst I did have a great time going and reading anthropologists from the 19th century, the middle of the 19th century, went and discussed with various indigenous peoples in the Americas, all up and down the Americas in both continents. And then they report exactly the same thing, that most of these people think that thought and the spirit is somewhere in the body and the heart. Nobody thinks it's in the head. I was also aware that there were bits of the world we were missing. And I think the most interesting example of this was right at the very end of writing the book. It might even have been in the proofs. I thought, I've really got to understand about Australia. And I asked various Aboriginal scholars about this through the internet. And eventually they came back, well, because my question was, where do Aboriginal peoples think that thought is? And I looked in a big 2-volume encyclopedia, which we did have in the library, of Aboriginal ideas, and the word brain is not mentioned in there. And the reason was explained to me, is that the question doesn't mean anything, because for Aboriginal peoples, they are not in their body. They're not enclosed either in their mind, in their head, or in the guts, or anywhere. They're linked with the land. So thinking and emotion and feelings and spirit, whatever that might be, are actually the person and the land that they're connected with. And that, I thought that was very interesting, and potentially a more widespread view before a more kind of localized internal view about what thought and so on was. So that's why I started early. But there were in fact 2 chapters. They ended up being compressed because there was a lot of fanciful speculation and me just enjoying writing about the cave painters at Lascaux, which had very little. In the end, I had to look at it and think, this doesn't actually take me much forward. So all that got cut and compressed into the current first chapter, which is on the heart, and then gets us onto the rather gruesome proof by Galen, the Roman stroke, Greek stroke, even Turkish physician who demonstrated at the beginning of the Common Era that the brain is what's doing thinking.
So let's drill into this a little bit here with heart. I found myself wondering as I was reading your book, if by starting with heart, which is chronologically appropriate and accurate, whether in some sense there wasn't also a bit of a claim there that the heart is kind of the original metaphor for the idea of brain. And I just wonder if you could tease that out a little bit for me.
I hadn't thought of it that way, and I'm not sure it is. I think what we've got there is this recognition by most people, for most of our history, that where we feel things, And that, as I said, we feel it in the guts. And if you're excited, your heart starts to pound, and your heart's early dissections showed you, the heart's doing something, it moves, whereas the brain is just this kind of gloop. So there was a reason for why there was this distinction. Now, because you've still got all that kind of linguistic baggage to do with heart, to do with it being the center of things, to do with the emotions, then I think when we start to think about the brain, then it's hard to kind of fit them together, because even more so today, we think of the brain in this very cold, calculating way. That's the models, both the mathematical models that there are trying to explain how it works, but also, we'll talk about this later, the big metaphor that has dominated us for the last 70 years, that of the computer. And that's kind of in a contradiction with this living, pulsating, bloody thing that we have inside us and which keeps us alive. So I think there's this interesting contradiction between the two. What it ended up, however, starting with the heart, was not only because the book is chronological largely, but because of the recent thinking about neuroscience, we ended up with a nice kind of loop in that we come back at the end of the book with ideas. There's a very famous article that was written 2 decades ago, which had the title, "The Brain Has a Body," which sounds kind of trivial, but for an awful lot of neuroscientists, that's quite shocking, because they're only interested in what's going on up here and they don't like to think about it. And you think of all those ideas of the brain in a vat, or, modeling the brain in a computer, all those models of brains in computers they're making, those brains don't have a body. Whereas we know it's absolutely essential for actual functioning and interacting and what the brain does.
Yeah, I mean, so at the very beginning with your sort of tweet-sized takeaways, you were very clear about why you organized your book around metaphor, but it is pretty obvious, and this, I guess, again comes back to my question to you about the heart as a metaphor for brain. I mean, you focus on mechanical metaphors as really the organizational trajectory of the book from pretty much the beginning to the end. So you talk about hydraulics, you talk about electricity, telephone exchanges, computers. That one you have a lot to say, because some of it quite provocative, I would say. You talk about hardware, wiring. I would add to this my own favorite, which is receptor, which I always think gets a little overlooked. But did you feel that there were other metaphors on offer? So did you focus on mechanical metaphors specifically, or do you just feel they sort of dominate?
Yeah, I do think they dominate. On the other hand, there are others, and what's interesting is that virtually every form of science, but biology in particular, can't actually talk about the thing it's talking about directly. We have to use this intermediary of saying it's like something. So so in the case of receptors, we're talking a lot about this at the moment with the COVID outbreak, the ACE2 receptor, and people will say, well, that's like a lock, and the thing that's going to activate it is like a key. And so from the very beginning of these, when these structures were identified at the beginning of the century, this lock and key metaphor was deliberately used, not only to communicate to the general public, but also for scientists to think about it. And then they had big arguments about how valid and tight a metaphor it is. So I think once I'd realized that was the kind of frame that I wanted to, or the things I was going to be looking for whenever I was reading, or I was going to go back and reread things and say, well, okay, well, what did so-and-so say about how they thought the brain worked? What metaphors they were using? And most of those metaphors are to do with, they're technological, I'd say, rather than mechanical. They're to do with the latest technology. And one of the things I noticed, even in my previous book, which was about genes and codes, which is a metaphor, that when you explain to scientists that they're thinking this way, because nobody's taught this way, nobody says, well, now we're going to use a metaphor. It's just said, and everybody, you write it down as a student, it just seeps in. And when you explain that these metaphors are limited, and they're limited in two ways: one, because they're not the real thing, but even more interestingly, they frame things. And to be rather kind of crass, a frame is also a cage. And that is, it stops you from thinking other things. When you say that to scientists, they get really excited because, especially when you've explained the history to them, they can see how ideas that the same thing has been interpreted in different ways, in different metaphorical lights. That suggests that in the future, some of the stuff we currently think, we're going to unthink. We're going to think in a different way, conceive it in a different way, according to new metaphors. And then they ask me, so what is it? What's the next big thing? What is the great new metaphor that's going to shed light? And to which my answer is, well, I wouldn't be writing books. You know, I'd be saying thank you in Swedish if I could do that. You know, I'd retire. I'd be very wealthy. So I have no idea. I just know that, you know, history shows us that that's going to be the case. And the reason is, as I said, that we don't have the right language. And I think what's fascinating is that the exception to this is maths and physics in it to an extent, especially maths. And they literally have another language. They don't, you know, they have, you know, equations and signs. And physics uses metaphor, but they actually ended up so kind of frustrated by, you know, billiard balls and stuff like that, that when they ended up identifying the new subatomic particles, they use nonsense words like quark, which doesn't, there's no way you can think of quark. I mean, unfortunately, they also said up and down and spin, and they used other things which are kind of completely deceptive about what's really going on. But they deliberately chose neutral, non-loaded words, whereas we're still struggling with receptor and all the other things in biology.
So I'm mindful that it's well, no, it's fine, I think. So I just want people to who are tuning in right now to start sending their questions to the Q&A. I want to give Matthew just a few opportunities to take his sort of large description of metaphor and put it into a little bit of concrete for us. So I'm going to put up a picture here. This is Arthur Keith's. This is Arthur Keith's comparison of a spinal cord with a telephone exchange, which appears in your book. Mm-hmm. Why don't you just in light of your remarks here about metaphor, why don't you just walk us through this one, and we'll see if any questions come in.
Yeah. So this is from Arthur Keith, who was. He gave the lectures, an anatomist, and he gave the lectures, the Royal Institution lectures, Christmas lectures, in 1915 or 1916, so in the middle of the First World War. And this is for children, and the series was called something like the machine body, or the body as a machine, or something like that. So each of the lectures dealt with a particular organ and used machines to explain it. So with the case of the heart, well, it's a pump, because, you know, it is. That was easy. Then he wanted to talk about the brain. And what he ended up doing was using a metaphor which had been around for about 30 years, which is that of the telephone exchange. And he put this little figure into the book, and I guess he projected it with a kind of lantern slide as well. And I was just very struck by it, because it is actually wrong. So it doesn't really understand how a telephone exchange works. So what we've got on the left of your screen is the telephone exchange. You can see it's got a transmitter, which is the bit you have to speak into, and then the receiver on the right, which you'll be talking to, somebody you're going to talk to. Now, a telephone exchange works by you, in the old days, you pick up the phone and you would talk to an operator, and the operator would then say, where do you want to talk? And you would say, I want to talk to, in my same exchange, number 1213, and she, because it generally was a she, would then take a cable and she would take it from your slot to the 1213 slot and then connect it. So the connections you would make between the transmitter and the receiver were flexible. And that's why people got really interested in the idea of the brain as a telephone exchange, because it wasn't like earlier in the 19th century, people thought that the brain worked like, and the body together worked like a telegraph system, which is fixed. So your wires go from the telegraph station where it's sent to the telegraph station where it's received, and there's no flexibility there. The telephone exchange is much more flexible, and your connections can go every which way. So what Keith has done, he's got his telephone exchange, fair enough, but he's then made a parallel with a spinal reflex, so which is like a knee jerk. Yeah, so if you think about a knee-jerk reflex, the doctor bangs you on the tendon on your knee and your leg flips up. And there's nothing you can do about that. And the reason there's nothing you can do about that is shown in the figure on the right, because it's hardwired. And it can only go one way. It can't go the other way. So there's no way of tapping your tendon and then your arm going up. It doesn't work that way. So Keith has kind of only half got actually what he's really interested in. He's got the idea of the telephone exchange, but he's then used the wrong example of biology, a fixed action reflex, a permanent reflex that you can't alter, but he's using a plastic, flexible technology to try and explain it. So, I mean, I guess at the time it would have been very hard for him to come up with an explanation for how the kind of things that you did at a neuronal level that would be appropriate for a telephone exchange. But very soon afterwards, this was exactly in the 1920s and 1930s, that was exactly how people started to think about the ability to learn, for example, about certain pathways changing. And that would mean that the connection between the transmitter and the receiver in the telephone exchange metaphor would be altered as a result of experience. How was that?
It was great. And let me, so we've had 5 questions come in so far. So I would like to just start off with, there's a question, is there any thoughts about the now established difference of use of the brain between men and women? I'm interested in this question personally because I'm not sure that there are established differences. So why don't you go ahead, Matthew, and tell us what you think?
Yeah, so the answer is, well, I'm afraid you're wrong. There is no known difference between, well, it's interesting. So clearly men and women are different, you know? In general, men and women different. Steve Jones, the geneticist from University College London, he used to say there is a gene for murder and it's on the Y chromosome. So, because most murders are carried out by men. Vast majority of murders all over the planet are carried out by men. So there are differences between men and women. The question is, where do those differences come from? How consistent are they? And are they reflected certainly in the structure of the brain? And that last question is, there is no identifiable, at the moment, difference in the structure of a male and female brain. You can't look at a scan, no matter how detailed, and say, that's a man's brain, that's a woman's brain. All that nonsense about left brain or right brain, women can't read maps and all this stuff. There's nothing one reliable about that. There's a lot of prejudice and anecdote. And secondly, as somebody who has been thinking about behavior and its origins in both genes and environment, and above all in the interaction between the two, you'd want to say, well, how consistent are these across time and space? The differences that, for example, we see in the West at the moment, you would have said, 100 years ago, you would have said, well, the idea of a woman being prime minister, I mean, I'm afraid Darwin argued this, that women really weren't up to it, and they were incapable congenitally of doing really, really complicated things. Now, there are a lot of 19th century women who I think he might have paid attention to, but you've just got to think about the change in the role of women in the West over the 20th century, in particular since the First World War, and again after the Second World War, the entry of women into the workplace and women pilots and astronauts and all the rest of it. So clearly, whatever differences there may be, those differences they're not consistent, and they are not primarily, I would argue, produced by differences in brain structure. There are all sorts of things like hormonal effects, because you know what, the brain's got a body, which are going to alter how we behave and so on. Plus, of course, we learn an awful lot from parents, from those around us. Anybody with young children who will have been dismayed to see perhaps that their young boy probably ends up being fascinated by strange mechanical vehicles that they have not suggested ever were interested in. But little boy has been watching telly. Little boy has got other friends who are interested in cars or trains or whatever. So those kind of differences are, I think, are much more likely to producing these effects rather than any fundamental genetic predisposition.
Yeah, I think for people who are interested in this question and want more details, I would recommend the scholarship of Cordelia Fine, who's done a lot of really fine work trying to tease out how much difference culture and society make and how much difference neurobiology makes. I think another way, just personally, I think about this a little bit is to say, that the differences between two human beings are very, very large, and it's quite hard even to explain that. So to sort of try to divide populations by genders and say that there are these distinct differences when you're only ever able to use fairly anecdotal subsets, it's quite challenging at the level of both structure and function. We have a question now. This goes back to your comment about, I think, Aboriginal peoples in Australia. The question is, where did you say they think their feelings are, and can you expand on that, please?
Well, the response from the scholars. I mean, I wasn't. I think she is an Aboriginal scholar. The response from the scholars was, this question doesn't make any sense, in that they wouldn't want to localize their feelings because their interaction with the environment, with the land in particular, means that there's a kind of permeability between whatever is happening inside them and whatever is happening outside on the land. So they are at one with the land on which they're living. One thing that did disappoint me was that I was unable to get any feeling for anthropological studies of Africa. And part of that is, I guess, because the colonial influence of the West will have kind of blurred out whatever was there, and perhaps people haven't been asking.
But almost certainly they were not asking. But that lends itself to another question that's come in. Have you discovered similar metaphors formed in isolated different cultures as the conception of the brain or neurology that parallel the modern era?
Well, yeah, the problem is people to know that either those peoples have to have survived with their culture intact so that you can anthropologists or others can go and talk to them and then record their statements, and you can be fairly confident that they are giving you a view of their original culture and not something they've learned from the West, or ideally they have to have left a written record. So if you're talking, and that's really, as a historian, what you want, because what people say, it's often very hard to see whether it's true or not. What's really interesting is what people write down, but that then gives you a very small subset of human culture. Certainly in time, you can't get any further back than whatever it is, 5,000 years. And for example, although there are plenty of things about the brain and the heart and the liver in writings in the Middle East, because the liver, especially in the Old Testament, was seen as being a very important place where your mind or your soul or your thought might be. There's no kind of consistent exploration of this topic. There's no philosophical engagement with it. And all that comes much later, even in China. So I spent a lot of time, I mean, I can't read Mandarin or any of the old Chinese languages, but again, using secondary sources, historians who'd done the work for me. Again, it was something that was not really interesting. And I noticed this in my very first book, which was about egg and sperm and where life comes from, reproduction. And again, I tried to find non-Western sources for this to see, well, what did they think about? And for example, in China, rather than localizing structure to function, which is what we're obsessed with, they were much more interested in contradictory forces and tensions. And so saying the brain is doing this, or saying the egg and the sperm are doing that, isn't something that, again, would make particular sense to them. And they only developed that way of thinking through contact with the West around about the 17th century onwards.
Yeah, I mean, I think also to the spirit of this question, I mean, even when we look at the past, we sort of encountered this problem because as your book shows, the idea itself is evolving steadily. And so it's very hard to resist projecting our ideas now either onto the past or indeed into translation. I mean, that's so like if somebody's talking about brain and they have an entire different cosmology associated with brain, the way as scholars, historians, or scientists, we looking at that, we can only translate it back into the languages that we know and we have. And when I think when we fail at that, what happens is we end up with this sort of inauthentic, almost feeling of posing in some way that becomes artificial. So it's a real challenge.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned translation. I've done a lot of translation, and that is one of the big problems, is expressing something, the essence of the idea. And sometimes when it's kind of a factual question, so somehow some thinker in the past has been groping towards what I recognize to be the truth, and which perhaps tomorrow may be a slightly less true, you can see where they're going. That's not too bad. But when you really don't understand what the words mean, it's very, very hard to think. And so I'm afraid I found this with John Locke, the philosopher, that I really did not understand much of what he meant. And I had a conversation with my colleague here in Manchester, Professor Helen Beebe, and I sent the bits I was writing about John Locke, and she's a Locke expert, and she said, well, your views are the same as those of undergraduates the world over. So I thought, well, that's okay. If I'm at a philosophy undergraduate level, I'll accept that. But it is really, really hard sometimes to understand what on earth people are talking about without, as you say, kind of superimposing what your assumptions.
Especially when you also have ideologies and other types of prejudices. And we've had a question come in about this. It's a little bit longer, but I think it definitely worth exploring. And actually, I'm going to take advantage of this opportunity also to just very quickly, I'll tell you the question first, but then I'm going to bring up Paul MacLean also, because I think we can talk about his triune theory of brain as a part of this as well. So the question is, have some conceptions and metaphors for the brain been more susceptible to biases like racism, sexism than, say, others? Or would it be used to justify certain worldviews like racial and sex superiority? When the heart was considered the center of being, was it similarly compared inter-individually towards these ends? This is a really provocative question.
That's a great question.
It's a great question. So I'm going to pull up just a picture really quickly of Paul MacLean here. And I'm going to just mention this because it also, I mean, one of the things, Matthew, so where I would sort of push your thesis a little bit on the mechanics of as an operating metaphor, I would say that there are a lot of evolutionary models that and zoological terms that absolutely dominate. Now, I don't think Paul MacLean was a raging racist or sexist. I don't actually know that, so he may have been, but I don't think he was. But this model that he promulgates, which you call so much guff, follows on a very distinct tradition of looking at the lamination of the brain and the sort of development of the brain, and then ascribing to it primitive functions and higher functions, so sort of lower base vegetative functions or higher base cerebral rational functions. Well, one of the things that of course, and this question is really great, that we have to sort of confront is that there was actually an evolutionary theory that tried to explain very precisely why, for example, the brains of white men who were colonizers and dominated other peoples had the capacity to do that. And one of the explanations was that there were actually more layers of brain tissue. So that was like 100 years before MacLean's time, but there's a way to see MacLean as updating that. So let's just get back to this really great question. We've got the biases, and I think also let's remember that asking the question about whether the heart can be compared inter-individually towards those ends too, because I think there's a two-part question there. But maybe you can talk a little bit, for my sake, about MacLean as well.
Okay, so MacLean is he was a neuroanatomist. He discovered, described, I'm not sure quite what the right word is, something called the limbic system. which I learnt about as an undergraduate, but which now neuroanatomists are arguing, does it even exist? And in 1967, he came up with the idea of the reptilian brain. So this is, or the triune brain. They've got 3 layers of your brain, he argues. And the one that you can see in the middle of the figure on the right there is the reptile part. And that is responsible for your most base and kind of primitive urges. And you don't need to believe that there are alien, reptilian aliens walking amongst us to see what's going on there. That we all, I'm afraid, do things and feel things and have urges that we might prefer we didn't. And what MacLean was arguing was that you can locate in this early, very primitive part of the brain. And on top of that, you've got an early mammalian layer. And then finally, you've got the kind of superior, the summation of evolution, which is also kind of an idea. He got this progression through the layers of the brain, is the cortex with which I'm doing my thinking and talking right now. Now, there's an element of truth in that you can certainly, the lower parts of the brainstem, if you lose a lot of the top of your brain, you can still, for example, stay alive. You'll carry on breathing. That's why you carry on breathing when you're asleep. Okay, you sleep, you can't think, you're not thinking. Well, you're dreaming maybe, but you're not, you're not conscious, but you don't stop breathing. Don't worry about it. That's the way it works. And yet, if, for example, you have sleep apnea, you will instantly wake up if your CO2 levels are dropping too low. And all that's done by these basal structures in the brain that are really kind of very, very basic, simple physiological organs. So MacLean comes up with the idea of this triune brain. So they've got 3 in 1, nice kind of religious nod there. And this idea is taken up by, what was his name? I've forgotten his name.
Carl Sagan.
No, before that. Arthur Koestler. Arthur Koestler writes a pop science book about this, and it does remarkably well. And MacLean becomes a very famous person. And one of the people who went along to hear him talk was Carl Sagan, who was astronomer, but was wanting to get into popular science. And he decided that this is great, and I can write a book about this, even though Koestler had just done it. And he wrote a book called The Dragons of Eden. And in The Dragons of Eden, he suggests that not only is this triune brain thing real, but even that in those lower layers, that's where we find memories. So you end up with memories, effectively species memories. They're not species, but memories in there of our encounter with the dinosaurs. So, I mean, this is just nonsense. I mean, it really is. I mean, you'd have to be smoking an awful lot of stuff to be able to believe this. But I mean, I read it and I was just staggered at how awful it was. Because Sagan, everybody loves Carl Sagan, that pale blue dot and all the rest of it. Brilliant science communicator, but goodness me, his first book is a load of nonsense. So, I mean, it's got Freud in there, it's got bad anthropology, it's just really crap. But underlying it is this problem of the triune brain. So let's go back to the topmost layer, that layer that I'm thinking with now. One of the problems is that, some of the smartest animals on the planet are reptiles. They're birds. I know we don't class them as reptiles. That's just kind of a mistake. They're dinosaurs. They're the non-avian. They're the avian dinosaurs that escaped the extinction of their fellows. And so they have crows. New Caledonian crows can make tools to make tools. So no primate apart from us can do that. They are that clever. So how are they doing that? If he's right, if MacLean's right, and this conscious abstract thought is only possible with the superior mammalian layers, how do we explain the behavior of the birds? Similarly, he says that it's rather bizarre in his book. He says, well, parental behavior, that's all to do with the mammalian part. You think, well, have you actually looked at any birds? They spend an awful lot of the spring engaged in extremely intense parental behavior. So there's some kind of very basic things that you think, you know, just a bit of thought would have made his thesis a bit richer. Final question. Did people look at people's different hearts? I don't know. I bet they did. I bet there was some horrible anatomizing went on in the 18th or 19th century where people of different ethnic groups will have been chopped up and they'd have said, I don't know, but my guess is yes, because kind of pretty much everything horrible that could happen did happen.
I think, you know, I completely agree. I don't know either. I bet my bet is also yes, because people are really good at figuring out ways to create stigma and categorize people as something they don't like. I mean, you sort of see it in the humoral system, just in terms of the way the stereotypes are about, say, the melancholic type or the you know, sanguine type. So I mean, I'm sure there are these physiognomic typologies that are used, that come out of a heart-centric system, that are used as a way of explaining why people are the way they are. I think actually you see that in like some of the early human science writers, like Comte de Buffon, for example, when he tries to talk about, or Montesquieu, when he talks about hot-blooded people and things like that. Where so it's probably there, and I think just the answer to the question about gender differences and race differences is yes, right? And the point about the reptile brain here is that this is just a new iteration of a really old idea that's kind of a bad idea that gets used and picked up sort of often heinously. And it's amazing how it's an idea that just doesn't seem to die. I mean, once we started talking about reptile brains, it just persists. And we have somebody who's asked about another myth that I just want you to debunk here and now, because we have an opportunity. Can you comment on whether the left brain, right brain thing is a myth?
It's a myth. Well, I'll tell you what, there is one thing, and this is really interesting. There is one bit of the brain that is lateralized, and I'm using it now. And that's this bit here, and it's to do with speech. But everything else is basically paired. Now, why this left frontal part of the brain and the bit further back that's to do with understanding speech, why they are lateralized, we don't know, but they are. And this, you can see this in some of the most eerie experiments that have been done, which are those with the split brain experiment, where people have, for medical reasons, had their brains separated so the two hemispheres can't talk to each other. There's no communication. So basically, they've got two brains now. And if you project something on the left, in the left visual field, then that goes to the right side of the brain. And if you ask somebody, what have you seen? They say, I can't see anything. I haven't seen anything, because they can't, that side of the brain hasn't seen it and it can't speak. This side of the brain can't talk. So it can't say, because it doesn't have control over speech. And so it turns out that these people have got two, I don't know what, minds, presences. And what's interesting is they behave in slightly different ways. When you give them moral questions, because there are various ways of asking the side of the brain that technically can't understand speech, you can do clever experiments. The left-hand side of the brain, so the one I'm using now, tends to say, well, if you give it a thought experiment about something bad happening and somebody does something bad by accident, most of us would say, well, if it's an accident, that's not so bad. The people with if you just talk to the left-hand side of their brain, they will say, oh, that's terrible, they should be punished. The right-hand side of the brain, if you can find a way of getting through to it, it will have a more normal reaction. But that doesn't mean to say you've got two sides of your brain. That means these people have had their brains separated. So the brain is whole. It is a single thing. And even studies of, many of the studies of fMRI, these scans of the brain, they don't always show localization, for example, of thought, of ideas and words, don't necessarily, they're not here. It's not, even though that's where, if you have a stroke at the back of your head, you might, left-hand side, you might not be able to understand speech anymore. And at the front, you won't be able to use speech. That doesn't mean to say that that's where words are sitting. They're all this stuff is distributed.
Well, I think that was a very good demolition job. So yeah, the answer though, just to repeat, is no. The myth, despite the lateralization of speech, the myth is
It's
just
very strong. If people want it to be
so
true,
strong. Yeah, it's like the
I'm not sure
reptile
why.
brain.
Well, you know,
Yeah,
so one of the things about in general about science, there's an awful lot of localization, the idea that a bit of your brain is doing something. There's a fantastic book that came out in 2015 by some sociologists of medicine and science, which just said, well, A, they said that a lot of this evidence is rubbish, and B, they said, so what? And if it is localized to this bit or that bit, what does that tell you? Nothing.
Yeah, it doesn't help. But you just mentioned a book, so we've got two questions. I think you can probably, we've got a lot that came in, and we're running out of time.
I'm happy to answer. I'll answer them, and then maybe they can be sent out by the organizers later on.
Well, one is, do you have a favorite metaphor of the brain? I'll preface this by saying that mine is hippocampus. So go ahead, Matthew.
Favorite bit of the brain.
No, favorite metaphor. I beg your pardon.
Metaphor.
Favorite metaphor for the brain. My favorite is hippocampus.
Well, that is part of the brain. You're being obtuse. My favorite, I don't know, is the one that's been most productive has been the computer metaphor. But I mean, I also think that is we're getting to the theme of the final half of the book, second half of the book, is how we're rubbing up against the edges of that. And it's not me that's saying it. There are loads of think pieces by very clever neuroscientists going, you know, we don't understand what's going on. People are arguing about, even, do neurons represent the outside world? They're very, very simple ideas about how a machine might work. They are then saying, well, that isn't how the brain works. So I think we're getting to the end of the power of this. Whether we're getting to the end of the use of the metaphor is another matter, because something would have to replace it. And I don't see anything on the horizon.
Yeah, one of the things you say in your book is that you wonder if we've actually hit the limit on metaphors that we can expect or anticipate to come, which I thought was provocative. But hey, another person has asked, do you have any books on from your research that you read that you particularly recommend to everyone here? I think probably the one I really enjoyed the most, I found the most useful, were two books. Let's see if I can see them. They're up there, by Gordon Shepherd. Gordon Shepherd is a neuroscientist, and he's written two books about the history of neuroscience, which I used and stole from terribly. And one in particular about the 1950s. It's just a whole book about the 1950s. And I found that to be really useful, very insightful. It's not cheap, so you have to order it from your library. But Gordon Shepherd, Gordon Shepherd, look, Google that, and you'll find his books. I thought they were brilliant. Yeah, it's the revolutionary neurosciences in the 1950s, I think, right. and it is an astounding book. It is really good. And
he was there, so it's also rich with his memories of what he did and what he learnt, and he knew everybody in it.
We have a link that just went into the chat to Gordon Shepherd's Wikipedia account. He, I think, is now retired emeritus at Yale University. Yeah. Perhaps one more question. I'm sorry to those of you who we've not gotten to.
I will reply. I'll reply in the text.
Does the study of brain, I think this is a nice one to end on, actually. Does the study of the brain help us understand what thinking is, specifically where it comes to creativity and free will?
I would say no. So there's nothing about free will in the book, or virtually nothing. So as I said at the beginning, I'm afraid I'm a bit allergic to philosophy. I think it's fantastic. So, you know, if you want to know what is good, then you ask a philosopher, because they're going to give you some great answers, and they've been thinking about this for 3,000-4,000 years. If you want to know how the brain works, I'm not so sure that philosophy is going to help. And for the moment, we don't understand. I mean, so one of the things we haven't talked about is quite how complicated the brain is, and our inability. And the example I use repeatedly at the end of the book and generally my talks is the lobster's stomach. So these are 30 neurons that aren't even a brain, that produce a rhythm, because the lobster's stomach has to be active and grind away. And People have been studying this for decades. They can model the neurons. They know exactly how they're connected. They know their neurotransmitters. They know everything about them. And yet you can't predict what will happen to that circuit, that behavior, if you change one of the neurons. You can do it in the animal, you can do it in the computer, and you don't get the same answer. So we don't understand the lobster's 30 stomach neurons. Understanding more complicated things like free will, if it exists, or creativity, which most certainly does, I have no idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think the amount of difficulty scientifically in thinking about even something like creativity, which we just do naturally, it's puzzling and baffling. But let me do a little bit of promotional work for you, Matthew, by also pointing out another one that you would think would be really easy and turns out to be really hard, and that's smell. So I know you have a new book coming out, and why don't we just take as a closer here that point about that I guess your book is actually out, but that point about the complexity here, and point out like something like smell, which is actually sense, turns out to be just incredibly complicated to explain. So why don't you tell us why?
Well, so the problem is that we can't even measure what's called the dimensionality of smells. If you think about sound, we can measure that in intensity and wavelength, the same with light. But measuring the sense of smell, we don't even know what the dimensionality is. So at the moment, we do not understand exactly how the sense of smell works. I mean, I've spent 40 years studying it, and we can't. So for example, people at the moment who've got problems with COVID, we now know that anosmia, not being able to smell, or parosmia, smelling weirdly, is one of the symptoms of COVID. How that is happening is still unclear. It's not certain. Something is happening, especially in the people who are smelling something different. Something is happening at the very periphery, the very first stages, where our neurons or their activity is being scrambled somehow. And rather than talk about complexity, I want to give one very brief example of something we do understand. I find it quite astonishing. There's a smell. I do talks on this, and this smell is only activates one particular kind of receptor. You've got about 400 different types in your nose. You've got 4 million smell cells divided into 400 types. Most smells activate lots of different receptor types, lots of different neuronal types, and that's partly what lies behind the magic. But there is this one smell called androstenone, which only activates one receptor type in your nose. And yet different people respond to it differently. I think it smells quite nice. Other people will say it smells disgusting, foul. And the difference between us is a single base pair in our DNA. One letter of our DNA changes. That changes one amino acid, which changes the shape of the receptor. So the receptor is like a lock. It's not a lock, but let's imagine it. Right? The smell comes in and it does something. It binds with the receptor, and that sends a message into your brain. And the way that binds causes slightly different messages to be sent to the brain. So the difference between me, who thinks it's nice, and maybe Stephen, who thinks it's disgusting, perhaps, I don't know, that is simply to do with the shape of a receptor and the signal in the neuron. Now, we don't know what that signal is because I can't put an electrode in a human's brain, I'm glad to say. But that's all there is. So the perception, what it tells us is that, although it doesn't feel that way, perception of all kinds is simply neuronal activity. And that goes for more complicated things and emotions and all the rest. That's all there is. There's nothing but neurons. There's no spirit. It's just neurons all the way down.
Well, on that message, I think it may be possible that Anthony is going to want to come back in, but here's the book. The idea.
That's the US title, and it's back to front.
Yep, I have the US title. So there you go.
They're different versions.
They're different versions, but they're both excellent.
Yeah, it looks lovely end papers. Ooh, you didn't get any end papers in the US version.
No, I didn't. I didn't at that. So I'm feeling embittered about that. But I just want to say personally, Matthew, thank you very much, and to all of you who sent questions to us this evening, I really appreciate that. We really appreciate that as well. I'm going to turn it over to our host of ceremonies, Anthony, and say thanks all. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. I know you've got a class to go to. You've got to go and teach some students. So thank you very much. It's been great.
Great. Well, thank you so much to both of you. There's some nice comments. What a fabulous hour. Fascinating. Thank you coming through. There's various links, like Matthew's new book, in fact, slightly newer than The Idea of the Brain, is one of the very popular series for Oxford University Press called the Very Short Introduction series, and he's doing one on smell. There it is. So just want to thank you. I've put a link to our website if you'd like to donate, if you enjoyed the event, because we are unfunded. The next event, I will now sort of say goodbye to Matthew and Stephen. So thank you very much to both of you. I'll bring up, I'm not very slick on this quite yet, but I'll bring up the share screen function, and hopefully this will now great. So yeah, this is going to be the next event. So it's on Tuesday the 15th. It's part of our Arts and Culture series, and it involves two authors on books on the BBC, Tom Mills, who's written a very provocative book called The BBC, The Myth of a Public Service, and Peter York, who's co-author of a forthcoming book called The War on the BBC. So it will be a discussion on the politics and the future of the BBC as an organisation at a time when it is under attack as never before. So I really hope you can join us for that event in a couple of weeks. And I would like to end by thanking you all for attending, and especially thanking Matthew and Stephen for a really great and stimulating conversation. So I will sign off there, and via our website, if you want to contact us, if you want to sign up, any email feedback, etc., just contact us through the website. So thank you very much. Good night.